are now tuned in to the Storm Tracker podcast.
Welcome back, family, to the Storm Tracker podcast. Marcus Benjamin here, representing for CanesCounty.com, part of the Rivals.com network. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all platforms and also subscribe to this YouTube channel live from Canes County. Also subscribe to the website CanesCounty.com for free. Use the promo code Miami30. Today I have John Garcia Jr. joining me from Rivals.com, national recruiting analyst, to talk a little Miami Hurricanes football and recruiting, because it's the best week of the year when it comes to Miami Hurricanes football, FSU week. And it's at home, so it's a golden opportunity for Miami to get plenty of players at the game to really give them the game day experience and hopefully end up with a recruit or a commit by the end of the weekend. Thanks for joining me today, John.
Yeah, always good to be on with you, Marcus. It's been a heck of a season thus far, and obviously this game is always its own storyline, but I feel like this year it's one of the more unique ones because of the circumstances. So excited to talk about it.
Yeah, those circumstances are Miami 7-0, undefeated, and Florida State 1-6. I can't really remember a time where there's been that much of a difference in record when it comes to this game. But generally, John, I kind of wanted to get your opinion on the team and the Miami Hurricanes. I mean, they're undefeated. You know, they've got the Heisman candidate in Cam Ward at the helm, and a lot of players have been making big plays all over the field. Xavier Restrepo makes a big play seemingly every week. The defense has been, hit or miss, and the weapons continue to make plays for Miami as well. What's your opinion on the Miami Hurricanes thus far? What's encouraging and what concerns you?
Yeah, I think obviously what's encouraging is what we see on offense. I mean, this is a team that every time their back is against the wall, and they faced, sort of consistent deficits, it seems like, over the last month in particular. There's no panic. There's a maturity. There is a confidence in this team that they can figure it out. I mean, in that Cal game, I think was really the first time that I was like, I mean, okay, they're confident, but this is getting, it's getting out of hand here, right? And sure enough, they still found a way to, to be basically perfect in the fourth quarter offensively behind Cam Ward. And I think they really sort of embody what he shows. Everyone talks about his charisma, I'll call it, back there. There's almost a, I'm playing at my own pace type of motion, like the Joker in basketball. Like it's a different pace than we're used to seeing at the quarterback position, but it's a confident one. It's a mature one. And I think the team has embodied that. And I think offensively, the O-line is great. I mean, that's something you expect under Mario Cristobal and Alex Mirabal. But I think they've done a really good job. Shannon Dawson deserves, of course, his own shout here. They've done a good job of not relying on one or two guys beyond Cam Ward. It seems like, he spreads the football around from a passing standpoint. There's a bunch of running backs that, on a given day could be the workhorse. It was obviously Damian Martinez this past weekend against Louisville. But previously, we've seen Mark Fletcher. We've seen the young guys, Jordan Lyle, Chris Johnson, come in and make a huge impact from the running back position. And then, the targets, when he does let it go, are plentiful. Restrepo, obviously the most consistent, the most reliable, as we probably would have predicted preseason. But multiple tight ends. I mean, 3, 4, 5 other wide receivers in that rotation that have splashed one way or another. I mean, there's really – when you think of, from a defensive standpoint, how to stop this team, where do you allocate your resources? Where do you push your resources? Do you load the box and say, hey, they're not going to get the running game going, and we're going to, trust our DBs to play these skill guys one-on-one? Probably not, right? Because, there's a mature group of receivers that can route you up. Okay, so let's sit back and try to keep everything in front of us So Miami will just run the ball in that circumstance, and Cam Ward can be a part of that, of course, as well. So there's really a pick your poison element to this offense, in addition to that confidence and maturity that they're sort of in it no matter what, no matter the score, the situation. And I think the whole team has embodied that offensively. Defensively, again, in the trenches, so strong. I mean, that D-line rotation is deep. I still think, obviously, Ruben Baines coming back now, that they're trying to figure out the right cadence, I think, with all of those guys. And Louisville was really good. So, I mean, that shootout, I don't think was something to, hang your hat about as a Miami fan. Louisville's a really good program right now, especially on offense. And look, we know that game for that roster means a lot because Louisville spends as much time in Florida as any program in the ACC and beyond. So a lot of Floridians combating the U once a year. But the defensive line's great. I think the question marks come with the back seven. That's where you start to wonder, what's the ceiling for this team if there is a game for whatever reason where the offense isn't just gonna figure it out and click. Can you go out and win a game defensively? Can you win a 14-10, old school type of game? I think that the best Miami teams we knew could go out and do that. Take it back 20 years. Remember the Boston College game. I think it was a 1-score game the whole time, and then Ed Reed strips the running back and takes it back. I mean, a gritty defensive cold game even. Can this Canes team get to that point? That's really the question mark for me. Safety play, I think, is a concern, a legitimate concern. It's been inconsistent. So I think there's a lot to figure out in that regard, but these are good problems to have because, like you said, it's undefeated, it's top 10 in the country, and the schedule's pretty favorable, which we wouldn't normally say with Florida State coming to town, but that is the case right now for Miami. So you've almost got a few games to, you don't want to say experiment in the middle of the season, but you got a few games to tweak the lineup and maybe give some young guys some experience. Hey, Zaquan Patterson's as good as it gets from a recruiting standpoint. Let him cook a little bit. Maybe these next game or two are opportunities for that to happen before you get to, a couple of tougher road games, certainly at Georgia Tech, and don't look now, but at Syracuse is looking a little bit, tougher than maybe we would have thought preseason as well, especially from a secondary standpoint with Kyle McCord doing what he's doing. So I think they've got to figure things out over these next few games, even if, it's a lopsided affair against FSU, against Duke, over the next two.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the back end of the defense because that's kind of been the talk of the preseason or the offseason, and now it's the talk of the in-season. And Zaquan Patterson seems to have done well enough to get some playing time. So it seems like he will get some playing time against Florida State based on what we've heard from defensive coordinator Lance Guidry this week. He did play some snaps last week against Louisville. Played solidly in that game, scored pretty high when it came to Pro Football Focus. So I'm interested to see kind of how much Zaquan Patterson will be used, not only in this next game, but for the next games coming forward. And, the fact that you mentioned about the schedule, it's kind of the gift and the curse, though, right?
Right.
Because, if they, run the table, yeah, great. A 0 on that side of your record is always a good thing. But when it comes to the eyes of the committee and, making the playoff, you'd want to play some ranked teams. And right now, there's not a ranked team to be found on the schedule. Now, not to say that Syracuse, like you said, might be ranked by the end of the season. And maybe Georgia Tech moves up as well if they keep winning as well. But yeah, I believe that schedule is favorable, like you said, but it could be a curse with Miami trying to up their resume in the eyes of the College Football Playoff Committee. Now, when we get to the end of the season, obviously the goal is to win the ACC, and right now Miami is kind of positioned themselves to be in that game, and it seems like it's going to be against Clemson. Last time Miami did play in the ACC Championship game was against the Tigers. was a game for Miami Hurricanes fans to forget for sure that year. And that was actually the same year, 2017, that the Hurricanes were undefeated for this long at this point of the season. If the ACC Championship game was today, John, against Clemson, who you got?
Well, I got the over, first of all, if that was the case, because both of these offenses have found something. I mean, everybody watched Clemson, Georgia, and wrote Clemson off. Hey, it's probably done. What's going on with Dabo? They should use the portal. What are they doing? Like, it was all these major pieces on the culture of Clemson. Well, as Georgia just showed us again this past week, that their defense, when they're on, is still very Georgia-like and can shut anyone down. But since that game, Clemson's offense has been absolutely explosive from a passing and running standpoint. So I think when you talk about what we just said, our potential weaknesses on this Miami team or areas for improvement, I think Clemson plays right into that with their ability to throw the ball with Cade Klubnik, another dual threat type quarterback who can hurt you that way. And obviously Clemson always wants to run the football because that's their traditional mentality as well. So I think it would take certainly an improved defensive effort to contend there. But again, on the flip side, can you envision anyone stopping Miami's offense at this point? I mean, it's really hard to see a team commit to one, stopping the run or sitting back for the pass and having sustained success. And I think Clemson would be included, in that conversation. Georgia was able to really, light it up through the air against Clemson. And obviously Miami is even more equipped to do something similar. So I think it'd be a great game right now. Obviously, I think Clemson's a bit more balanced offensively and defensively, but at the same time, Clemson's schedule, offers the same question marks, that Miami's has. Because again, the one marquee opponent was Georgia, and it was, an embarrassment really for the Tigers. So I think that the two teams are on a similar path. And I think when you look at it in 2024, it has to be in that context. It can't be in the late teens context, because that 2017 team that ran into Clemson, that was peak Clemson, right? I mean, this is the transition from Deshaun Watson to Trevor Lawrence and national titles and best team, best recruiting program in the country, arguably, in that stretch. This is not that. This Clemson roster is a little bit more senior laden and dependent on a smaller group of guys than even Miami's roster is. So if it is a shootout, let's say, in a fourth quarter game, I actually would favor Miami in that regard because of its consistency in the trenches and its depth at those skill positions. I don't think Clemson can go as deep in terms of reliable guys offensively to move the needle. So I'd give a slight edge to Miami today, but obviously we're going to see, about a month more of these teams, before we potentially get to that point. And they both have questions still left to be answered.
Yeah, absolutely. Long way to go until that game, but always fun to kind of see, where people's heads at when it comes to Miami and Clemson. Both teams ranked in the top 10, both teams projected to make the playoff, regardless of who wins that ACC championship game. But back to this week, John, FSU week. Miami is expecting a boatload of recruits coming to Hard Rock Stadium Saturday night, prime time in Miami Gardens. Close to maybe, I'm expecting over 50 recruits. It could get up to maybe 70 recruits. It depends because, a lot of players start trickling in, during the day that we're not aware of. So just when you see the list, John, and you see the amount of recruits and the elite level players that are scheduled to visit Hard Rock Stadium, which player or players do you feel like Miami has to make some progress with over the weekend?
Yeah, I think the first group of players that grab my attention are the commits. The list you put up at Canes County, I mean, all those Miami logos on there, I think it's 20 plus commitments coming back to town. I think that is the first indicator of, hey, it's a huge game and we're here to help. I think that's always an X factor in recruiting. We talk about coaches and NIL and visits and flips and all this stuff. But when you're being recruited by your peers who have no rules against recruiting you, contacting you, seeing you, any of those things, it hits different. When you're talking to a player or a group of players that already know, hey, I'm coming here in like 3 months. I'll be here. Come do this thing with us, because you see what Miami's doing now. Now we think we can take the next step and be the recruiting class that gets them over the hump as well. I think that changes the atmosphere so much. And I go back to that Miami versus Florida game early to kick off the season, where there was a lot of uncommitted recruits there. What happened? By the end of the game, they were sort of cheering for Miami, right? If for some reason FSU hangs around or even wins this game, you're not going to see a bunch of these recruits in the stands doing the Seminole chop. I just don't envision that. So that viral video, the controversy, all of that stuff that was at UF, in late August, you will not see here, because there's a lot of Miami commitments, solid commitments, that will be back in town. And then obviously the next group of recruits that captures your attention are the ones committed to other programs. I mean, DJ Pickett is coming back. I mean, that is going to be its own storyline. This is the number one recruit in Florida. This is a legacy recruit for Miami. And what position does he play? The position we've been talking about. He's a secondary player, whether it's corner, nickel, safety. He's 6'4" and can do a little bit of everything. So he's a potential instant fix to some of these issues we've been talking about, especially relative to the rest of the top targets Miami's going after. So I think a lot of Miami commits and the Miami staff views him as a potential final piece to the DB puzzle in this class of 25, which is really strong at the DB position. Bryce Fitzgerald is incredible. Another versatile guy who could be corner or safety. Chris Ewald, as consistent a corner as there is from a coverage standpoint in this class out of Chaminade Madonna. I mean, this is a great group already. They're looking for that final piece. But there's some other guys committed to one school that are visiting Miami that are interesting. Shamar Arnaud is one I was talking to a little bit yesterday. USC commitment out of Georgia, but he grew up in Broward. He's still got roots in South Florida. He's got, a lot of ties to this program, very close to Chris Ewald, who we just talked about. They grew up together. So this is his first time coming back down in like 2 years, though. So I think this is a big deal for Miami if they're going to make a play for Arnaud, who's another big DB, legitimate 6'2", 185 pounds or so, press corner, a lot of the alpha mentality, that you expect, from a kid like that. Committed to USC, Miami, Auburn, Colorado. Many schools are trying to put a dent in this race, but the ball's in Miami's court right now with this visit coming up. So I think that could be another interesting one to keep an eye on. And then, the other guys who are committed to other schools all have some kind of connection to Miami. Like, a Jarquez Carter's a D lineman committed to Ohio State. His teammate, Micah Newton, is a Miami commitment. Both will be in town, on Saturday. Again, how much could that potentially help in the pursuit of a flip? And that's another position of need, in this class of 2025 for Miami. Great class so far, but the finishing pieces look like, defensive line, secondary, wide receiver. Those are going to be the premium spots that Miami looks to fill out. And there's going to be a lot of opportunity to make up ground or potentially, close the gap with some of these guys come Saturday and potentially into Sunday. A lot of these guys are local or semi-local. You get them hanging around for a night game, and then, hey, we got a hotel, we stayed overnight, and let's hang out Sunday as well. That can easily happen during a weekend like this, again, especially with so many commitments in town. A lot of resources can be pulled there, and it could be a weekend that, looks like the beginning of the turning point, for this class towards, further elite status, locking in a top 5 class, or maybe even pushing higher. If that's going to happen, I think this weekend's going to play a huge part.
Definitely. I agree with you, just with the fact that you got so many Miami recruits, or so many Miami commits rather, that are going to be present, that are going to be recruiting these guys hard. I think that's a huge factor. Nearly the entire class is going to be present for this Florida State game. And that, I think, is potentially going to be a game changer. But when you look at this class just quickly here, what position need do you think like Miami has to kind of fill here for the 2025 class?
Yeah, I think there's still questions at safety. You know, a lot of great corners are in this group, or guys we think are going to start out at corner with maybe some safety upside. So I think, again, obviously a DJ Pickett, a Shamar Arnaud, guys like that could certainly, you know, be huge targets to potentially round out the class in the secondary. And then the defensive line. You know, this is a group that, you know, I think nationally we talk about strong positions in the class of 25, just overall. You know, offensive tackle comes up, I think quarterback comes up, wide receiver, maybe even corner. Pass rusher and these defensive linemen aren't necessarily looked at as a strength overall in this class of 2025. So I think finding another piece or two there could be critical for Miami, because there's not as much volume going forward in this class. So whether it's flipping a guy like a Jarquez Carter, or moving or taking a chance on a guy who's maybe less heralded with more upside, even, I think that type of recruit could help round out this class as well. But it's certainly going to be on defense. I think offensively they've got a great O-line class, verbally committed, a huge big surprise, right? Huge O-line class, verbally committed. Gerard Pringle's an elite running back. I think they might even be done with one running back in this class. I think he's that good. I think he's probably going to wind up as the number one back in the state of Florida as we do rankings meetings here in the next few weeks. So wide receiver on offense, I think, would be a position where you can maybe see a little bit more of a push as well. Obviously brought in a great group last year, led by JoJo Trader and company. So this year you're not going to get as much volume, but maybe you grab another guy or two when all is said and done. Because right now, of course, it's just Josh Moore and Dalen Upshaw. Moore will be back in town, which I think is a pretty big deal for Miami. He's obviously one who, you know, just flipped from Florida. Florida is still very much in that conversation. FSU is still in the conversation as well. So, you know, other schools have fallen off, but the in-state schools are still pushing there. And he's a supreme talent you got to hold on to. So even those kind of visits, you know, make this weekend just as big. But I think receiver, we could see a little bit more, you know, of a push down the line as well.
Yeah, when I look at this class, the first thing that jumps out to me is defensive backs and just how many they have and how many they are still considering. You mentioned Arnaud, you mentioned Pickett, a couple other guys they're still kind of considering for this 2025 class. And then linebacker, with the loss of Elijah Melendez, you would think that you want to replace him with a guy as well. Defensive line, I think they are, you know, pretty solid, but you could always use another three technique type of guy. If you can grab a Jarquez Carter, I mean, that would be massive, I think, for this class. He's a guy, you know, that I fell in love with at the Rivals 5-star in Jacksonville. He just dominated with his strength and agility. And, you know, like you said, that wide receiver class is interesting because, you know, you only have two now. Of course, Miami's still likely going to push for a lot of other wide receivers, including Vernell Brown, and maybe try to flip, well, not flip, but get Malachi Toney back into the class. So there's definitely some options there at wide receiver. The running back room is very interesting. The fact that Gerard Pringle is the lone guy, and it doesn't seem like there's another guy that they are particularly looking at. That room is already pretty loaded. So those are the positions for me that kind of stick out. I think everywhere else, they're pretty solid. They're solid at tight end, solid at O-line. Luke Nickel is your guy at QB. But when this weekend is all said and done, with the amount of recruits that are coming to visit Miami in South Florida, you would think that Miami's going to get a commit by the end of the weekend, you know? So who do you think is going to be that guy? If you had to put some money on it, or if there is like a betting line, who's like, I don't know, plus 100 right now.
Could you imagine if we get to that point as a recruiting industry where we're putting lines on kids committee? I wouldn't put anything past a sports book nowadays, especially with football, obviously the king sport in this country.
Right.
But if that were the case, yeah, I'm probably looking at the back seven. I think you bring up a great point at linebacker. Obviously, Miami lost Elijah Melendez, as you said, and really around that same time, we started hearing a lot of buzz about Kellen Wiley at a Sefner Armwood, teammate of Gerard Pringle, who has really exploded over the last year or so with his recruitment, 6'4", 230, just a body where you could see him on the edge or you could see him, playing off the ball if he stays relatively trim. We know Miami's very high on him, as are many other programs. He doesn't have a lot of trips planned going forward, but he will be back at the U this week. And I could see that, being a potential commitment scenario. And then if we even want to expand it to 2026, there's a lot of top juniors that are going to be making this trip to Coral Gables or to Miami Gardens for the game itself. And I think you could see some action there, maybe even a flip. If it was going to be a flip, I think Jalen Waters, another Armwood, a prospect, would be one to keep an eye on. He's been waiting to get back down to Miami, currently committed to Florida, one-time FSU commitment as well. So, he might make the big three trifecta in commitments. I can't remember the last recruit to do that. But Miami's really buzzing with him. He talks to them very consistently. Georgia did just offer him, so maybe that slows him down a little bit. But right now, the only visit planned is Saturday to Miami. And I think that says a lot about where Miami views him and where he certainly views Miami. So I think, secondary, linebacker are probably the two premium spots where I would expect, if there were to be a commitment, I would expect it in one of those two categories.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. John Garcia joining me from Rivals.com, National Recruiting Analyst, talking a little Miami Hurricanes recruiting. John, thank you for joining me once again for another edition of the Storm Tracker Podcast.
Always a pleasure.
That's going to wrap it up for the Storm Tracker Podcast. Make sure you follow us on Twitter and all the other social media platforms. Make sure you also follow this podcast on all platforms. Most importantly, subscribe to the website, canescounty.com, for free. Use the promo code Miami30. Until the next episode.